Reede pealelõunast oleme siis jõudnud nende nädalatega varustuskindluse 3. webinarini. Täna tuleb juttu võimsusmehhanismist ja ennem kui annan sõna meie ekspertidele, kes täna siis räägivad nii teostatud võimsusmehhanismi uuringust kui sellest, et kas Eesti vajab võimsusmehhanismi. Hästi lühidalt on siin slaidi peal siis veel ka kirjas see, et millest oleme rääkinud kahel varasemal varustuskindluse webinaril, ehk siis esimesel webinaril rääkisimegi Eesti varustuskindluse normist, rääkisime siis sellest, et mis on see optimaalne suurus, mis võiks olla Eestisse tundide arv, kus optimaalne oleks mitte teha uusi investeeringud tootmisvõimsustesse, vaid pigem sotsiaalmajanduslikult on efektiivne tarbimise mahakoormamine ja veel kord siis olgu siin öeldud, et see sugugi ei tähenda, et Elering arvaks, et nendel tundidel jääb tulevikus elektrit puudu või et see oleks tundide arv, hoidku jumal selle eest, kus oleks blackout Eestis, et see lihtsalt on kehtestatud norm, mille vastu me siis hindame, et kui üle selle on analüüsi alusel tundide arv, siis tuleb rakendada täiendavaid mehhanisme, millest siis tänasel webinaril ka juttu tuleb, et mis need siis olla võiksid. Ja teisel eelmisel webinaril siis rääkisimegi sellest, et milline on see metoodika, mille alusel süsteemi piisavuse analüüsi tehakse. Rääkisime lisaks sellisele tavapärasele NSOE poolt läbi viidud ja suuresti ka tulevase AFRY metoodikaga kooskõlas oleva lähenemisega läbi viidud analüüsi usaldusväärsusest, et tõesti anda kindlustunnet ka Eesti turuosalistele, Eesti osapooltele, keda see teema huvitab, et see analüüs, mis on tehtud, on tõesti usaldusväärne, et ta põhineb üle Euroopa parimal teadmisel, mis siis nii tootmisvõimsuste kui ülekandevõimsuste kohta on olemas ja et see on midagi, mida me saame usaldada. Lisaks siis kõnelesime enda poolt, et me oleme ka enda majja nii mudelid kui inimesed loonud selle viimase aasta jooksul, et suuta ka ise analüüsida nii Eesti kui regiooni varustuskindlust lisaks tavapärasele deterministlikule analüüsile, mida me oleme aastaid teinud ja mida te olete saanud varustuskindluse aruandest lugeda. Oleme siis ka loonud tõenäosusliku analüüsivõimekuse ja tõesti nii üks kui teine siis peaksid koosmõjus nii tavapäraste kui kriisitsenaariumite puhul meile andma vastuse, et kas ja mida on võimalik või kas ja mida meil tuleb siis teha selleks, et varustuskindluse norm tagada. Ja täna siis räägime, nagu juba kõneldud, võimsusmehhanismist, et siis detsembril, täpsemalt 3. detsembril tulla tagasi siis juba regulaarse Eleringi varustuskindluse aruande tutvustuse juurde ja siis ka sellel varustuskindluse seminaril räägiks konkreetselt, et milline on Eleringi vaade Eesti varustuskindlusele ja seda siis kõigi nende varustuskindluse koostisosade põhiselt ehk nii võrgu piisavus, töökindlus, süsteemi opereerimine kui ka siis siin käsitlusel, nendel webinaridel käsitluse all olnud tootmise ja ülepiiriliste ühenduste piisavus ehk siis süsteemi piisavus, ehk et see on siis varustuskindluse seminar, kus me põhimõtteliselt anname ka meie positsiooni nii täna kui 2030 selle kohta, et kas varustuskindlus on Eestis tagatud nendes piirides ja selle varustuskindluse normi alusel, mida me täna oleme siis teinud Vabariigi Valitsusele ettepanekuks Eesti jaoks kehtestada. Aga nüüd minnes tänase sisu juurde, siis tänane sisu on võimsusmehhanism ja me palusime, et mitte ise jalgratast leiutada, teades, et paljud Euroopa riigid on vastava võimsusmehhanismi loonud ja mõtlevad selle peale, et millised on need parimad praktikad ja milline võiks olla kõige parem võimsusmehhanism Eesti jaoks, et me tegime hanke ja hanke tulemusena parimaks pakkujaks osutus AFRY ja siis küsimus on, et milline on most suitable capacity mechanism for Estonia. And now we can turn our next presentation and please, Brian, floor is yours.
Hi there, it's Simon here from AFRY.
Sorry.
Is that okay? Is this the right timing?
That's most important, that you are right guy to give a presentation.
That's fine, that's fine. Just to check you can hear me okay and you can see the slides.
Really great. Yeah, we listen you very well.
Great.
Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad to be able to join the webinar and to be able to contribute to this important discussion on security of supply in Estonia. So I'm from the energy practice within AFRY Management Consulting, and we're a leading provider of strategic, commercial, regulatory and policy advice across the European energy markets. So the reason why I'm here and talking today is because during the course of this year, we've been working with Elering and also alongside the Ministry and the Competition Authority, focused on possible capacity mechanism models for Estonia in the event that such a scheme may be needed in future. So the slides that I'm going to walk through now draw from the work that we've done as part of this project. So here, just a quick introduction really to provide a bit of a backdrop for the study and outline the focus of the study. So in terms of the state of play and the context, obviously you will know better than me that Estonia has a history of self-sufficiency in terms of its electricity supply, but there's a number of factors out there that mean that the landscape is changing, whether that's closure of some of the existing thermal capacity, growth of renewable capacity, and also the increased importance of interconnection. And this changing landscape has prompted discussions in relation to adequacy looking forward into the future. It's important to note that studies that have been done by Elering and by NSOE in relation to security supply indicate that there's a very, very low probability of any issues in the near to medium term. So it's not like there's a looming issue based on these studies, but it's interesting to note that where issues have the potential to arise, there's some linkage to the non-availability of several pieces of interconnector infrastructure concurrently. So that's an important element for where we go with the rest of this presentation and study. So given the changing landscape, there was a collective decision that it would be sensible to consider what kind of capacity mechanism options were out there and could any of them form a kind of backup plan in the event that such a scheme was considered to be necessary in order to support adequacy. The context is, however, that there's a preference for retention of an energy-only market, but this capacity mechanism would be a backup available in the need only. So our study was focused on the identification of a suitable potential capacity mechanism for the Estonian context in the event that the decision was taken down the line that such a scheme were to be needed. So before walking through some of the elements of the study, just a little bit in terms of the drivers for capacity mechanism adoption. And what we've seen historically in other markets is that the spread of capacity mechanisms has been linked to a missing money problem, which it creates issues for the conventional investment paradigm in thermal assets and flexible assets in particular. So the traditional challenge has been that within the energy-only market, the investments are reliant on there being price spikes, and investors require that there's credibility that there indeed will be price spikes, and they will be around for long enough to cover the cost of investment and to earn a return. But price spikes aren't necessarily popular with everybody, and there can be pressures to dampen them. So that creates a gap in terms of the income stream for projects, which challenges the investment case. So that was traditionally the challenge, looking back to the schemes that were in place in the 90s, for example. I guess more recently, there's been additional challenges that have been thrown into the mix. So with the growth of renewable penetration, and since the financial crash in 2008, a flattening or lowering of demand in some cases, the thermal providers have more limited running hours, and so they've got fewer opportunities to earn income, and so they're effectively squeezing all their revenue recovery into a smaller number of operational hours, which becomes challenging. So in combination, these two things are kind of in play in various markets at the moment, and these factors are behind the adoption of capacity mechanisms in a number of jurisdictions across Europe and indeed elsewhere. So when we talk about capacity mechanisms or capacity remuneration mechanisms, there's a whole host of things that term encompasses. And the taxonomy that's on the screen now just tries to highlight the diversity of schemes that are out there and the range of forms that they can take. So here we differentiate between different options in a few different respects. So first, there's a distinction as to whether or not the scheme is targeted or whether it's market-wide. And for targeted schemes, what we mean is that the capacity mechanism is only applied to a subset of the market, generally a reasonably narrow subset of the market, whereas in the market-wide, the application is far more broad, so capturing most of the capacity within the market. The second distinction is whether the scheme is a quantity-based scheme or a price-based scheme. In quantity-based schemes, the general approach is that the arrangement sets the amount of capacity that's required in order to deliver a security standard, and then the process for allocating that capacity between different players determines the price. So the price floats depending on the kind of market dynamics. In price-based schemes, things operate slightly differently. So here, either a price or at least algebra for determining a price are set up front as part of the mechanism design, and the quantity of capacity that's actually delivered off the back of that floats. So they're two different ways in which you can approach the problem. On the right-hand side, there's a host of different schemes that can emerge by taking different decisions on this decision tree. And I think for our purposes, there's four that are just worth a quick introduction. So the first of those is the strategic reserve mechanism. So this is a mechanism that allows a discrete subset of capacity to be contracted to be held for use only in very extreme circumstances. And this capacity is deliberately separated from the rest of the market and is not able to operate in the wholesale market as other capacity is. So it's ring fenced. So that's the important one, the strategic reserve model. The next important one is the fourth model down. So this is a method of, so it's a market-wide scheme which relies on capacity auctions to allocate capacity contracts. And the nature of the contracts and the obligations that flow from those contracts are for the provision of kilowatts. So they're an auction to secure kilowatts of availability. And this is the type of scheme that's in place in GB at the moment. The third scheme I just want to briefly introduce is the one that's the next one down. In fact, actually no, the third from the bottom. So the other one that has capacity auctions as part of the solution. So here, capacity auctions for reliability options. So again, this is a market-wide scheme, but the nature of the contract and the obligation that are allocated through the auctions are different. So rather than securing kilowatts of availability, you're securing an option product, and the way in which the parties are incentivized to deliver energy is very much linked to what's going on in the energy market, because there's a system of difference payments that need to be made in the event of system stress periods. And the fourth and final one to introduce is more or less in the middle. So a decentralized obligations model. Again, a market-wide one, but here the emphasis is not on central procurement or centrally coordinated procurement of capacity. Instead, the market players trade bilaterally. So retailers typically have an obligation to secure a certain amount of certificates to fulfill a reliability obligation, and they can then trade bilaterally with holders of those certificates in order to secure what they need. So they're the four models. So strategic reserve, which we see in markets like Finland and Sweden, the capacity auctions model with a kilowatt availability product, which you see in GB, the capacity auctions with a reliability option product, which is what we see in Ireland and Italy, and then decentralized obligations, which is in place in France. So our approach for the project was split over 4 different blocks. So the first element was to identify what the specifics were for the Estonian context, because it's obviously very important that the solution isn't just an off-the-shelf solution. It's one that's tailored to the specific requirements for the market. The second was to do a little bit, but in more depth, what we've just done, just to give an overview of the options that are out there and draw on case studies for how some of these schemes have been implemented, and relative successes, etc. Then I guess the meat of the study was in the third box down there, to do assessment of different options within the Estonian context. So that included both qualitative assessment against some objectives, which we'll come on to in a second, and then quantitative assessment as well, to look at the socio-economic impacts of different schemes. And then the final element was to try and draw conclusions and say which of the models that we've considered do we think would be the best fit if a model was required in Estonia. So one important element that shapes the assessment is the backdrop that's created by some of the European regulations. So specifically the electricity regulation from last year, so for 2019, has some quite clear requirements in relation to any potential capacity mechanism. And there's 2 particularly relevant elements, which are shown on the left-hand side of this slide. So the first is that the EU regulations make it pretty clear that if any kind of capacity mechanism is demonstrated to be needed, the ability of the strategic reserve model to address the underlying problem must be assessed first. So strategic reserve is the kind of first option that the EU regulations require you to go to. And it's only if analysis suggests that strategic reserve isn't sufficient to cover off the adequacy issue that a member state is able to go on and consider other options. So it's quite a clear line in the sand in terms of the preference from the EC's perspective in that regard. The second important feature relates to CO2 limits. So the regulation applies some quite clear limits in terms of the the participation from plant that has a higher CO2 emissions than others. So in terms of new plant, so that means plant introduced after the regulation, so from the middle of 2019, new plant isn't eligible if it emits more than 550 grams of CO2. For older plant, there's a slightly more subtle arrangement. So from 2025 onwards, older plant wouldn't be eligible to participate in a CRM if it has spot emissions above 550 grams CO2 per kilowatt hour, and it also doesn't meet an annual CO2 bubble of 350 grams of CO2 per kilowatt installed. So this is obviously quite restrictive, in particular for plant like the oil shale plants, and if they were to participate, it would imply, quite limited operational hours, with hours in the kind of low hundreds, depending on what you might be assuming in terms of biomass co-firing, for example. So they're the two key elements of the EU regulations that are important. On the right-hand side are other things that generally relate to the scheme being pro-competition, non-discriminatory, etc. But they all need to be factored in if the EC is going to clear a scheme. So the first loop of assessment we did was qualitative. So we identified a number of criteria that were used within this qualitative assessment, and they're shown across the top of the table here. So the first was their suitability for the context in Estonia and the problem that could potentially be needed to be addressed. The second was whether we think there's an appropriate allocation of responsibilities given the problem. The third is compatibility or ease of clearance with the EC requirements, given what I introduced on the previous slide. And then we have effects on the wholesale market operation and administrative ease. And from this, we highlighted that the strategic reserve model looks to be the best of the four conceptually. We felt that it was the best solution for the particular problem. So remember I mentioned earlier that we felt that the problem stemmed from simultaneous interconnector outages, which have a very low probability of occurring. So having a targeted solution to cover off that type of issue feels more appropriate than having a market-wide capacity solution, which is probably better suited to covering off peak demand issues rather than these kind of freak outage issues. Strategic reserve models run typically by the TSO, but could be some other central actor, and it felt to us like having a central agent in that role was best, rather than having it decentralized, as is the case in the fourth option here, a decentralized obligation route. Clearly, given the contents of the previous slide and what the EC's regulations say, we felt that it was pretty obvious that the strategic reserve model is the most likely to pass and get clearance, so it performed well in this regard. It also has the potential to perform well in terms of minimizing energy market impacts, assuming that the design is effective and good. Then it has, it can avoid distorting the way that the wholesale market works. And given it's a targeted scheme, experience from other markets suggests that it's the simplest of the schemes to administer, and so it has attractions in those other regards. So strategic reserve, based on a qualitative view, came out clearly on top, and then of the others, the second option down seemed to us to be the next best, largely because of the way in which the option contract arrangements work and link into and kind of enforce the incentives in the wholesale market. So for that reason, we took forward a strategic reserve model and then this kind of capacity auction model, but with a reliability option contracts as the product forward into the quantitative analysis part. So within the quantitative work, we assessed strategic reserve model and this market-wide capacity auction model against the energy-only context. Given that we or given that there are normal circumstances don't suggest the security of supply issues, we needed to do the assessment assuming some kind of stress tests, so that we could see what would happen if indeed there was one of these kind of low probability concurrent interconnector outage issues. So we looked at a few different cases involving different levels of interconnector outage. So the full IC case, which we'll see on the next slide, assumes that the interconnector capacity that Estonia has with its neighbors is fully available. The N-1 scenario assumes that some of the linkage with Finland is unavailable, and then there's an N-2 scenario which assumes that additionally there's a further reduction in some of the capacity with Latvia. So the modeling was done using some of the NSOE scenarios, so specifically the national trends as the backdrop, and we focused on 2 years, so 2027 and 2031, to try and see how things might look at different points in the medium term. So, conscious this kind of includes quite a lot of content here, but what we were looking for within the analysis was what do these models mean potentially for socioeconomic welfare impacts. So what we've got in the charts here are the outcomes in 2027 on the left and 2031 on the right. And then across the bottom on the left-hand side, we've got the three cases with strategic reserve, and then on the right-hand side of each chart, the three cases with a market-wide CRM. So in each case, we're working from left to right, from having the full interconnector capability to having reduced, and then again further reduced interconnector availability. So some of the things that are evident here are that the white diamonds show the net position as a result of the introduction of these schemes, and so what we see is it's clearly the case that if the full IC capacity is available, introduction of any of these schemes actually has a net disbenefit. So in all of the left-hand sections, the white diamond is below the line. So there's if these problems, these low probability interconnector outage events don't happen, then we've obviously got a net disbenefit. But then if we consider what happens elsewhere, if we do walk into the N-1 and N-2 cases, we see that the dark orange element, which is the expected energy unserved and the value associated with that starts to increase. And so perhaps unexpectedly, as we get into more and more severe situations, then the benefit of having some kind of scheme in place is more apparent. That said, whilst it looks like the market-wide CRMs actually deliver a higher benefit, for example, in this N-2 case, given the fact that these instances aren't very likely to happen, it means you're actually spending additional money to try and cover off events with a very low probability. And the strategic reserve model doesn't quite deliver you the same net benefit in these extreme cases, but it does deliver a benefit, but at a lower cost. So our perspective was that the strategic reserve model looks to deliver the more moderate results in both directions. So it's less, it has smaller disbenefits when things are below the line, but also smaller benefits when things are above the line. But it seems like it's the more sensible option to go for, given the fact that we are dealing with these kind of low probability events. So our perspective was that, given it's more moderate, that the strategic reserve option looks to be the better. So the conclusions that we drew were informed both by the qualitative work and the quantitative work. And the place we landed in was probably no surprise that, from what I've said already, was that the strategic reserve option does look to be the best fit for Estonia in the event that such a capacity mechanism intervention is considered to be necessary. So the modelling results perhaps weren't compelling one way or the other, but they, as I said, they gave more moderate outputs for the strategic reserve case, which is an important factor. But probably the clincher links back to the EC requirements, and nothing from what we looked at suggested that there was any suggestion that the strategic reserve model wouldn't be adequate, wouldn't be able to cover off any adequacy issues. And so given that, and given the EC requirements, you almost can't go any further than that anyway. So that's quite a big factor in the landing on the strategic reserve as being our view in terms of the preferred option for Estonia. Then, with that conclusion in mind, there's obviously further work to be done if the scheme is to be progressed to develop some of the technical and operational parameters that are listed at the bottom of this box. But these are kind of design details and implementation details that would need to be progressed, as I say, in order to get the scheme into life, if that was considered to be appropriate. And then the final slide here is just to give a sense for timeframes that we're looking at. So here we've got a bit of an indicative timeline for the introduction of CRM, given what we've seen in other markets and given the kind of typical time spans that are required. So here, from the risk identification at the top through to the actual start of operation, of the scheme, and by that I mean the capacity that's been secured through the scheme is actually on the bars and operational. You could be looking at anything up to 7 years from the identification of need through to the implementation of the scheme. Now, I think that given the work that's been done so far, if the scheme is to be progressed in Estonia, we're kind of part way along the road already. So it wouldn't be that we're starting at the very left-hand side of this and then got 7 years to run. I think we're part way through this first element, certainly, at least. And then, depending on the blend of capacity that's required, whether you need 3 to 4 years lead time to allow new build is a question, just depending on what's required. Arguably, with a strategic reserve, you could have a shorter implementation time here. So that's a sense of where we got to within the study and the conclusions. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Simon, for your very comprehensive and presentation and very clear messages. We have a next presentation from Erkki, and Erkki is going to speak Does Estonia needs capacity management at all? I'd like to ask Simon that may you stay in the line, I don't know, next 15-20 minutes, that I'd like to take all questions together after Erkki's presentation. That I hope that Erkki already answered at least a couple of questions which raised from auditorium based on your presentation. And I now turn back to the Estonian language. That meie järgmine esineja on Erkki Sapp, meie enda energiaturgude osakonna juhataja, ja Erkki siis räägib sellest, et kas Eesti vajab võimsusmehhanismi või mitte. Erkki, ole hea, sõna sul.
Aitäh, tere pärastlõunat ka minu poolt. Ma siis oma esitlusega võimsusmehhanismist alustan sealt, kus Simon pooleli jäi, ja räägin veidikene võimsusmehhanismist Eesti kontekstis. Aga kõigepealt tuletan meelde laiemat konteksti. Esimesel veebiseminaril me rääkisime varustuskindluse normist. See on siis, näitab, kui suur peaks olema riigi varustuskindluse tase. See on, määratakse majanduslikult optimaalseimal moel. Ja me rääkisime, et Eesti jaoks koostatud uuringu põhjal on nendeks varustuskindluse normi väärtusteks siis 9 tundi piirangutundide arvu ja andmata energiat kuni 6 gigavatt-tundi aastas. Teisel veebiseminaril me rääkisime süsteemi piisavuse hinnangust, eelkõige siis üle-euroopalisest tõenäosuslikust süsteemi piisavuse hinnangust. rääkisime, kuidas seda tehakse, rääkisime, et selle tulemuseks on üle kogu Euroopa kõigi riikide jaoks siis need samad piirangutundide arvud ja andmete energiakogused. Ja need 2 tükki kokku võimaldavad meil siis hinnata, kas Eesti varustuskindlus on piisaval tasemel või ei ole. Juhul, kui süsteemi piisavuse hinnang näitab, et Eesti varustuskindlus on parem kui meile kehtestatud varustuskindluse normi piirangutundide arv, siis on kõik korras ja midagi täiendavat ette võtma ei pea. Nüüd tänase seminari teemaks ongi siis olukord, kui üle-euroopaline varustuskindluse hinnang näitab, et probleem on ja varustuskindluse norm ei ole täidetud. Sellisel juhul viimase võimalusena on võimalik rakendada võimsusmehhanismi. Miks ma ütlen viimase võimalusena, on see, et võimsusmehhanism on täiendav turumoonutus ja juhul ja enne uue turumoonutuse tekitamist on kasulik ja mõistlik eemaldada eelnevad turumoonutused selleks, et me ei asuks vanade turumoonutuste likvideerimist uute turumoonutuste tekitamisega. Nüüd veel meeldetuletuseks, et varustuskindlus, Elering defineerib varustuskindluse 4 komponendi põhiselt ja kõik nad on olulised, elektritarbijale ei ole sisuliselt vahet, miks elekter on ära, elektritarbijal on oluline, et elekter oleks olemas ja seetõttu on olulised kõik need alussambad, nii süsteemi töökindlus, võrgupiisavus, süsteemi piisavus kui küberturvalisus. Nendel 3 veebiseminaril me oleme rääkinud eelkõige süsteemi piisavusest, aga loodetavasti tulevikus saame käsitleda ka teisi varustuskindluse sambaid. Tulles nüüd tänase teema juurde, võimsusmehhanism, alustades selle defineerimisest, et võimsusmehhanism on siis ajutine meede elektrisüsteemi piisavuse jaoks vajaliku võimsuse tagamiseks, mille raames tasustatakse võimsuste omanikke selle eest, et võimsus on kättesaadav. Ehk siis tootjatele või juhitavale tarbimisele makstakse püsivalt mingisugust tasu, et need tootmisvõimsused või tarbimise juhtimise võimsused oleksid kättesaadavad. Oluline rõhutada, et tegemist on riigi abiga, millele kehtivad Euroopa Liidu ühisturul kehtestatud reeglid. Need reeglid ei ole seal ilmaasjata, reeglite eesmärgiks on turgu moonutava riigiabi minimeerimine, et tagada vaba konkurents elektriturul, et elektrijaam Portugalis ja elektrijaam Soomes saaksid võrdselt konkureerida ühisel Euroopa elektriturul. Oluline on ka silmas pidada, et võimsusmehhanism on kulu elektritarbijale, kuskilt peavad need maksed võimsuste eest tulema ja need tulevad tavaliselt elektritarbijatelt nende elektriarvel. Kuna elektri hind on majanduse konkurentsivõime üks aluseid, siis seetõttu ei tohi võimsusmehhanismi rakendada kergekäeliselt. Elektriarvele lisatav täiendav summa tähendab seda, et kodutarbijad saavad osta vähem teisi asju ja ettevõtted on maailmaturul vähem konkurentsivõimelised. Ja lihtne näide sellest samast AFRY uuringust, mida Simon presenteeris, on see, et 280 megavatine strateegiline reserv läheb Eesti elektritarbijale maksma circa 15 miljonit eurot aastas täiendavat kulu. Ehk siis sõnum on, et võimsusmehhanismi rakendamine ei tohi olla kergekäeline otsus. Aga miks siis üldse tegeleda võimsusmehhanismi ettevalmistamisega, kui me ütleme, et varustuskindlus on täna ja ka lähitulevikus heal tasemel ja see on täiendav kulu elektritarbijale. Siiski, kuigi elektrisüsteemi piisavus on hea, siis energiasüsteem on täna pidevas muutuses ja muutused on kiirenevad. Eleringi missiooniks on varustuskindluse tagamine ja me peame olema kindlad, et ka ootamatute olukordade saabudes on võimalik elektrisüsteemi piisavus tagada. Lisaks, ja ka nagu Simon mainis, uute võimsuste investeeringud võtavad aega ja otsusest kuni tootmiseni kulub üldjuhul aastaid. Seega, kui elektrisüsteemi piisavuse hinnang näitab, et piisavus ei vasta varustuskindluse normile ja midagi on vaja täiendavat teha, siis meil on olemas plaan, Eestil on olemas plaan, kuidas võimsuseid lisada ja varustuskindlust siiski tagada. Nüüd mõne sõnaga veel strateegilisest reservist, mis oli siis AFRY uuringu järgi Eesti jaoks kõige sobivam võimsusmehhanism. Strateegilise reservi üks suurimaid eeliseid on see, et minimeeritud on mõju elektriturule, kuna strateegilise reservi hulka kuuluvad võimsused ei osale samal ajal elektriturul ja seega ei ole elektrituru hinnateke strateegilise reservi olemasolust mõjutatud. Ehk siis elektriturg, energiaturg toimib edasi samamoodi nagu varem ja investeeringuid saab teha ka tulevikus elektrituru hindade vastu, mitte ei pea jääma alati ootama uut võimsusmehhanismi. Lisaks ütleb Euroopa elektrienergia siseturu määrus, et strateegiline reserv on kõige soovitatavam võimsusmehhanism ja seda peaks kasutama alati, kui see aitab elektrisüsteemi piisavuse probleemi lahendada. Ehk siis mingit muud võimsusmehhanismi võiks kasutada ainult juhul, kui strateegiline reserv riigi elektrisüsteemi piisavuse probleemi ei lahenda. Strateegiline reserv sobitub hästi ka Eesti olukorda, kus meie peamiseks probleemiks varustuskindluse osas saab olla mitme välisühenduse üheaegne avarii. Muul juhul meil andmata energiaprobleemi või varustuskindluse probleemi ei teki. Ja lisaks lisab kindlust see, et strateegiline reserv on rakendatud Soomes ja Rootsis, ehk siis me saame tugineda heade naabrite kogemusele. Aga juhuks siis, kui me peaksime strateegilist reservi rakendama, siis mis on need sammud, kuidas sinna jõuda. Kõigepealt tuleb põhjendada rakendamist või rakendamise põhjendatust. Euroopa elektrienergia siseturu määrus sätestab need tegevused, mida võimsusmehhanismi rakendamiseks on vaja. Kõigepealt peab kas üle-euroopaline või riiklik elektrisüsteemi piisavuse hinnang näitama, et varustuskindluse olukord tulevikus ei vasta varustuskindluse normile. Ja juhul, kui riiklik ja üle-euroopaline hinnang lahknevad, tuleb seda erinevust põhjendada AFRY-le ehk energeetikasektori reguleerivate asutuste koostööametile. Kui see on tehtud, siis tuleb Euroopa Komisjonile esitada rakenduskava koos ajakavaga, mis kirjeldab, kuidas eemaldatakse regulatiivsed moonutused ja turutõrked ja Euroopa Komisjon peab selle rakenduskava koos ajakavaga heaks kiitma. Ehk siis Euroopa Komisjon kontrollib samuti üle, et kas riik on vajalikud meetmed kasutusele võtnud ja võimsusmehhanismi rakendamine on ikka põhjendatud. Ja lisaks on vaja teha ka uurimus selle kohta, milline on kehtestatava mehhanismi mõju naaberriikidele. Seejuures tuleb konsulteerida neid naaberriike, kellele sellel võimsusmehhanismil võib mõju olla. Kui see kõik on tehtud, siis tuleb taotleda riigiabiluba Euroopa Komisjonilt. Lisaks tuleb kirja panna ja avaldada detailne võimsusmehhanismi ülesehitus, see tähendab siis eelkõige detailsed tehnilised nõuded osalevatele võimsustele, vähempakkumise ülesehituse ajakava ning ka tasude väljamaksmise reeglid ja tasude maksmiseks vajalike kulude katmise allikad. Ja seejärel me oleme valmis vähempakkumise korraldamiseks, kus siis tootjad ja juhitav tarbimine saab teha pakkumisi, millest odavaimad valitakse strateegilisse reservi. Natukene ka naaberriikide kogemustest võimsusmehhanismidega. Soome rakendab strateegilist reservi juba alates 2007 aastast. Seal on praegusel perioodil, ehk siis perioodil 2020 kuni 2022 strateegilise reservis hoitav võimsus 611 megavatti. Soome vaatab seda kogust iga 3 aasta tagant üle ja praegu on strateegilise reservi omamine Soome poolt põhjendatud eelkõige Olkiluoto tuumajaama valmimise viibimisega. Rootsi rakendab samuti strateegilist reservi alates 2004. aastast ja neil on praeguse seisuga plaan strateegiline reserv lõpetada 2025 aastal. Leedul on samuti plaan rakendada võimsusmehhanism, aga mitte strateegiline reserv, vaid võimsusturg ja neil on käimas riigiabiloa taotlus. Leedu puhul üle-euroopaline elektrisüsteemi piisavuse hinnang ei ole näidanud Leedu jaoks, et neil oleks varustuskindluse probleem. Samas Leedu enda teostatud riiklik analüüs näitab probleemi ja et võimsusmehhanismi oleks neil vaja aastaks 2025. Praegu siis käivadki tööd Leedul selle nimel, et riigiabiluba saada. Samas veel ei ole nad põhjendanud seda, miks on nende riiklik analüüs erinev üle-euroopalisest analüüsist ja samamoodi peavad nad läbi käima rakenduskava ja naaberriikide mõjuhinnangu analüüsid. Võimsusmehhanismid omavad ka mõju naaberriikidele, ehk siis meie naaberriikide võimsusmehhanismid suurendavad tõenäoliselt ka meie elektrisüsteemi piisavust, kuna naaberriigid hoiavad lihtsalt rohkem võimsust. Samal ajal võimsusmehhanismi rakendamine, mis ei ole strateegiline reserv, vaid näiteks võimsusturg, selline mehhanism võib vähendada siis naaberriikide tootmisvõimsuste konkurentsivõimet. Jõudes siis kokkuvõtteni, tahaks öelda, et seniste analüüside põhjal on Eestis varustuskindlus tagatud ka lähematel aastatel ning seetõttu me ei näe, et võimsusmehhanismi oleks vaja rakendada, kuid siiski me oleme valmis nii Elering kui Konkurentsiamet kui MKM, kes on selles võimsusmehhanismi uuringus osalenud, on valmis selleks, et juhul kui võimsusmehhanism on vaja rakendada, see ka rakendatakse, kuid me teame, et kuna see on täiendav kulu elektritarbija elektriarvel, siis seda otsust tuleb kaaluda ja langetada vastutustundlikult. see on kõik minu poolt. Aitäh!
Aitäh, Erkki, selle ettekande eest, mis puudutab siis, puudutab seda, et kas Eestis on võimsusmehhanismi vaja rakendada või mitte. Me tuleme loomulikult kõigi nende 3 samba juurde, nii standarduuring kui mehhanism siis juba ühes esitluses ja Eleringi poolse positsiooniga tagasi meie varustuskindluse seminaril. Aga meil on laekunud ka mõned küsimused ja ma võib-olla kõigepealt võtaksingi küsimused Simonile. Simon, are you still there? Yes, I see you. Okay, you are on the line. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions to you, and maybe we do like that I read those questions loudly and take it, let's take it question by question really. That basically 2 questions is are regarding capacity remuneration mechanism and the logic that is there any point to introduce a national capacity remuneration mechanism, or is there point to do the wider regional capacity remuneration mechanism? One question is that is there maybe point to the Baltic common CRM, and another that we know that as Erkki also presented that Finland and Sweden already exists or they have and there exists capacity remuneration mechanism that do something together with them. That how you comment that? What is the strengths and weaknesses between national and regional CRMs?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll give my perspective on that, certainly. And as you said, it's certainly the case that a lot of the markets nearby have got schemes in place or in development. So you've got Lithuania and Poland, as well as Finland and Sweden nearby with schemes either in place or in development. I think there's something to be said for doing things regionally if that's feasible and if the problem is a regional problem. So the way in which the kind of adequacy assessment requirements that are set out in the regulations work, there is a requirement to do things at a regional level to try and determine whether there is a regional issue or not. And so I think the emphasis is on trying to make sure that the adequacy concern is assessed thoroughly when you consider what your neighbours and etc. are able to do, and then that could lead to a regional scheme. I guess the challenge to a regional scheme comes in more in terms of its governance and the arrangements for getting it in place. The different markets will place different responsibilities on, for example, the transmission businesses. So you'll have your license and your license requirements to do things in the Estonian context, and others will have their requirements and obligations to do things in their jurisdictional context. So I think that can pull people to do things at a national level because they're trying to make sure that they are doing things to comply with their license and the obligations that sit under that. I guess the other challenge to doing things more regionally is it comes back to how the costs and benefits are shared out. So you could see a case where one of the markets in a cooperation approach is perhaps paying out more than it's benefiting. So there are challenges in trying to get things to work at the cross-national level. But I certainly see there being logic in doing the assessments at that level, and if there's a regional issue, trying to get a regional scheme in place, because then you hopefully minimize the extent to which there's distortions when you get to the cross-border points.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment and answer. The another question is related to state aid. That please elaborate a bit further the relations between the CRM and state aid rules. That how easy or what kind of reasoning must be there to get the permission for GRM?
Yeah, so part of the case for justifying a CRM requires that you've done a decent amount of analysis to suggest that there's no other option. So you've considered other options and implemented other options to the extent you can. So whether that's through changes to the way the wholesale markets work or other things. So there needs to be a demonstration that you've tried to resolve the potential adequacy issue through all other mechanisms. And so then it's only if you can demonstrate you've explored other options and they either aren't sufficient or aren't up to the job, can you then go and do the justification for the CRM. And in essence, there's a lot of analysis that needs to underpin it to show that the intervention is necessary and justified in order to deliver security supply to the region or the market that's in focus. So yeah, quite a burden of proof, if you like, on the member state that's seeking to advance the CRM in order to make the case to the EC.
Okay, thanks. And final question is related. You used the term missing money, and maybe you explain as well a bit that who get this money and who pay that the money, that how it really works, that if you use such term missing money.
Okay, yeah. So the term it refers to a kind of gap, if you like, in the income stream and the revenue stream for an investment. So I guess the traditional energy only paradigm is that the investment is based off the back of expected wholesale market revenue streams, and those revenue streams are sufficient to get the investment over the line, to cover the costs and to get the return that's required. So where there's an issue is if there's a shortfall, and that's what the shortfall is what missing money refers to. And what the capacity mechanisms offer is a route for saying, okay, you're going to get your energy market revenue, but what we're able to do is have an explicit, distinct revenue stream that's linked to capacity. And then through that distinct and separate capacity revenue stream, you can effectively top up and remove that missing money, so that across the combination of the wholesale market revenue expectations and then any capacity market revenue expectations, that gap is plugged. In terms of who pays it, I mean, ultimately it all comes back to the consumer at the end of the day, but the way in which the capacity charges are levied probably varies a bit between different countries, but certainly in my experience, they tend to be paid by the suppliers to the retailers in the first instance, and then the retailers will recover it through their bills to end consumers.
Thank you very much. It seems there is no more questions to you, Simon. That once again thanks you, and it as always very pleasure to work with AFRY. That all the best and take care.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Ja lähme nüüd edasi küsimustega Erkile, et üsna hulga küsimusi on laekunud ka Erkile ja ma võtaksin siit järjest, et siin on veel mitu küsimust, mis on seotud Leedu võimsusmehhanismiga, natukene sa sellest ka rääkisid, aga võib-olla siin on küsimus ka sellest lähtuv, et kas Leedu poolt koostatud võimsusmehhanismi analüüsi, kas Elering on seda näinud, kas me oleme seda uurinud ja mis me sellest arvame, ja kui me ei ole uurinud, siis miks me ei ole uurinud?
Okei, jah, Leedu elektrisüsteemi piisavuse hinnangut me oleme näinud ja uurinud. Kahjuks on see leedukeelne, ehk siis meie võime seda uurida on piiratud, kuigi Google Translate tänapäeval juba aitab päris palju kaasa. Ehk siis me oleme seda uurinud ja kui küsija soovib meie hinnangut sellele, siis lühidalt meie hinnang on see, et see ei vasta sellele, mis elektrisüsteemi siseturumäärus ühelt elektrisüsteemi piisavuse hinnangult ootab. Ehk siis ta ei paista olevat tõenäosuslik ja seal ei võeta arvesse ülekandevõimsuseid teiste riikidega selliselt nagu üks tõenäosuslik elektrisüsteemi piisavuse analüüs seda tegema peaks.
Aitäh. Siis on küsimus, mis on nüüd natukene laiem kui ainult võimsusmehhanisme, aga ta ilmselt läheb kokku sellest lähtuvalt selle teemaga, et nagu sa ütlesid, et praegune meie parim teadmine on, et see on selline tööriist, mis meil on olemas, aga me seda tööriista ei plaani praegult kasutada, kuna puudub vajadus selle tööriista kasutamiseks, et pole naela, mida selle haamriga sisse oleks vaja lüüa. Aga küsimus ongi selle kohta, et ja see on siis nii-öelda küsija sõnad, et Elering on öelnud, et heade ühenduste korral on kõik korras, kuid ENTSO-E analüüs on vist näidanud, et terves Läänemere regioonis jääb 2030. aastaks elektrit puudu. Mis me siis teeme, kui importida ka kuskilt pole ja ükski meretuulepark pole veel võrku ühendatud? Ehk siis küsimus on see, et kas ENTSO-E analüüs on näidanud, et Läänemere regioonis jääb 2030. aastaks elektrit puudu, siis sealt lähtuvalt ka, et kas Eestis jääb puudu ja et kas on vaja importida ja kas on kuskilt importida.
Just, et just väga oluline on vaadata varustuskindlust regionaalselt ja üle-euroopaliselt ja ENTSO-E analüüs ongi just see, mis seda elektrisüsteemi piisavust üle-euroopaliselt vaatab ja ükski senine ENTSO-E analüüs ei ole ühekski aastaks öelnud, et Eestis ega Läänemere regioonis oleks elektrit puudu või et see elektri puudujääk oleks isegi lähedal sellele normile 9 tundi aastas, millest me esimesel veebiseminaril rääkisime. Ehk siis lühidalt ENTSO-E analüüsid ei ole sellist probleemi näidanud ega tuvastanud.
Aitäh. Rohkem praegu hetkel küsimusi ei tundu olevat. Üks moment, Andreselt on siin jätkukommentaar. Siin Andres väidab, et ülekandevõimsused on seal olemas. Ma ei tea, kas sa tahad või oskad seda ilmselt rohkem kommenteerida.
Kui see on küsimus, et siis...
Ei, see on pigem ilmselt väide, jah, et kas sa tahad seda kuidagi veel täiendavalt kommenteerida omalt poolt, ma siit järjest nüüd võtan.
See on Andreselt väga õige väide. ENTSO-E üle-euroopalises analüüsis on ülekandevõimsused olemas ja neid võetakse arvesse.
Ma küll arvan, et küllap Andres siin mõtleb seda Leedu enda analüüsi, aga...
Okei, jah, ülekandevõimsused on ka selles Leedu analüüsis olemas, aga need ülekandevõimsused korrutatakse läbi koefitsientidega, mille saamislugu ilmselt oskavad kommenteerida leedukad, aga see, kuidas need koefitsiendid saadud on raskesti arusaadav ja sellega vähendatakse üle poole võrra impordi võimekust Leetu. Okei,
aga siin on veel üks küsimus ja teeme siis, et vaadates aega, et see on siis praegu ka viimane, et kas Elering peab võimalikuks arvata strateegilisse reservi ka Kiisa elektrijaama?
Kiisa elektrijaama me tõenäoliselt ei arva strateegilisse reservi. Kiisa elektrijaamal on täiesti omad ülesanded AFRY reservina. Ehk siis vastus on tõenäoliselt ei, kui midagi olulist ei muutu.
Aga aitäh, Erkki, sulle selle ettekande eest ja nende vastuste eest küsimustele. Et lõpetuseks ma ütleks võib-olla nii palju, et ka omalt poolt siia juurde, et kindlasti Elering on selle võimsusmehhanismi loonud just selle vaatega strateegilise reservi näol, et kui siis tõesti peaks analüüs näitama, et meil on võimsust puudu ja see analüüsi tulemusel me ei suuda varustuskindluse normi täita, siis me kindlasti ka seda tööriista kasutame, mis meil valmis on selleks otstarbeks, aga me tõesti ei tahaks seda kuidagi teha olukorras, kus ükski analüüs ei näita, et probleem on, aga meile justkui tundub, et võiks olla lihtsalt probleem või kellelegi tundub, et võiks olla probleem. Eleringile kindlasti meeldiks, kuna Eleringi missioon on hoida tuled põlemas ja kodud soojad, et mida rohkem elektrijaamu, seda parem. Sest ilmselgelt meie töö on lihtsam ja me saame oluliselt rahulikumalt magada, aga täpselt selle medali teine pool on see, et keegi peab selle arvega kinni maksma, kui need elektrijaamad ehitatakse sellisel kujul, et nad energiaturu põhiselt ära ei tasu. See ongi täiendavad kulud meie tarbijatele, see on vähenenud konkurentsivõime, et see on tasakaaluakt ja täna, ja millest me siis ka kindlasti 3. detsembri varustuskindluse konverentsil pikemalt räägime, et miks me siis nii arvame ja kust see elekter siis ikka täpselt nii täna kui 2030 tuleb, et kuskil on see elektrijaam, kes sel hetkel seda elektrit toodab, aga et me täna ei näe koheselt vajadust seda võimsusmehhanismi rakendada ja tarbijatele seda täiendavat koormust, mis elektriarvele tekiks analoogselt nii, nagu on taastuvenergia tasu lisada. Loomulikult võib aru saada tootjate huvist täpselt selle sama missing money probleemi lahendamiseks, et kindlasti on arusaadav, et tootjad lisaks sellele rahale, mis on elektriturult võimalik teenida, tahaks saada ka võimalikult palju turuväliseid toetusi, et oma tehtavate investeeringute või tehtud investeeringute kasumlikkust suurendada. Aga meie siin eelkõige vaatame just varustuskindluse küsimust ja võimsusmehhanism on selleks loodud, et siis tagada see optimum, oleks need võimsused olemas selles ulatuses ja oleks need investeeringud saaksid oma katte, mis selle varustuskindluse tagavad, aga mitte rohkem, et ühiskond ei peaks maksma üle. Aga sellega olemegi tänase viimase webinari 3 sellisest sissejuhatavast webinarist lõpetanud, ehk on nende 3 webinari tulemusena veidi rohkem huvilistel aimu sellest ja loodetavasti ka usaldust, et mida me siis oleme teinud koos väliste konsultantidega nii standardi uuringu kui võimsusmehhanismi välja töötamisel. Ja siis juba järgmine kohtumine 3. detsembril varustuskindluse konverentsil. Aitäh kõigile kuulamast ja ilusat saabuvat nädalavahetust. Kõike head!